I wouldn't do that if I were you, but they ain't listening. And a shipwreck today on another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Acts chapter 27 and 28, and then of course tomorrow we're going to do Colossians 1 through 4 and Philemon or Philemon, however you want to say it, as well. So let's jump in and see what the Bible has in store for us today. Chapter 27, the sailing for Rome. He's heading out for Rome on a ship, right? Well, they got on this ship, but the ship was kind of going a different way. The route of travel reflects the need to sail close to the land and to tack against the winds here. And the ship from Adramyttium would have taken them out of their way, since it was actually going to follow the coast of the province of Asia. So as a result, at Myra, on the southern coast of Asia Minor, the centurions found a ship from Alexandria that was going to Rome. Now, the Alexandrian ship would have been part of the grain supply trade that went from Egypt to Rome. So clearly, that's going in the right direction that they need to go in. So the journey was being undertaken at the very end of the sailing season, so the ship ran into some difficult seas and difficult weather. So we got to keep in mind the season and what they're going through here, right? Now, sailing was pretty dangerous from mid-September to mid-November, and the waterways closed for travel from then until February. Now, it appears that Paul's journey occurred in roughly mid-October, which was kind of right in the middle of that bad season, right? So Fair Havens, here in verses 7 through 9, was not a suitable place to spend the winter because the harbor was exposed to the open sea. Now, the crew thought that this general south wind that was blowing at the time would push them to their destination, and they were going to give it a shot. Paul kind of gave more, man. We probably not ought to try that, but the seasonal northeaster, of course, kicked in and blew the ship away from Phoenix and into the open sea. That messed them up pretty bad. We get to verses 17 through 19 of chapter 27 here. And here they are, caught in the wind. The sailors had virtually no control over the ship. It was just blowing them wherever it wanted to blow them. And they tied ropes around the hull to bind it tight and to keep it from ripping apart. And to gain buoyancy, they jettisoned anything that had any weight. Things like their cargo and their tackle, but not the grain. They kept that on there. That was their moneymaker, right? So since the storm blacked out the sun and the stars, the crew was actually unable to chart their location. You think, well, it's just dark. They can just sail in the dark, but they used the stars to navigate by, and they used the sun to navigate by. If it was cloudy all the time, they had a hard time navigating and seeing where they were. If they got away from the land far enough to where they couldn't see any land, they'd have no idea where they were going if it was all cloudy, right? So that was pretty significant. And of course, they would have tracked the alternation between day and night by noting the vague light of day here. Now, refraining from eating in chapter 27, verse 21 through 26 was probably either due to seasickness or to fear. It could even been due to superstition, because you know how sailors are. But rather than reprimanding the crew for failure to take his advice earlier, Paul related his encounter with an angel who revealed that Paul had a greater destiny than death by shipwreck. He was actually destined to appear before Caesar, right? And the world's premier power. So the divine plan would not be thwarted, especially by those who had acted so foolishly and ignored Paul's advice here. We get to verse 27, and the Adriatic Sea that's mentioned here is actually not the same one that is currently known as the Adriatic Sea between Italy and the former Yugoslavia. It actually probably refers instead to the modern-day Ionian Sea between Crete, Malta, Italy, and Greece that extends into the Mediterranean Sea. And the sailors, of course, took soundings by letting down lengths of weight on the rope. Here, I read Mark Twain go, Mark Twain. Well, that's a measurement on the rope of depth. They determined that they were actually approaching land pretty fast because they measured it. It was pretty deep, and they measured it again. It got shallower and shallower as they measured it. So that means they're approaching land, right? But they couldn't see this land. So in an effort to slow down the ship, they took the unusual action of lowering 4 anchors off from the stern rather than dropping just 1 anchor from the bow, which would have swung the ship around. When that anchor hit, the ship would have flown around. So we get to verses 30 and 32 here, and of course the prospect of imminent landfall after being adrift on the stormy sea for 2 weeks actually enticed a group of sailors to attempt, selfishly I might add, an escape plan on the skiff or the lifeboat. But Paul's wisdom, of course, in preventing this is seen in the very next episode when all hands were needed later on. And of course in verse 36, Paul's example of steadfast faith when he says he began to give thanks to God, and practicality when he began to eat here in the midst of the storm encouraged the other battered sailors to do just the same thing. And of course the crew here at the end of this chapter throws out the grain which had been acting as a ballast for the ship so that they could run it aground. So then we move on to chapter 28. I'm going to throw this map up here so you can kind of see what's going on and where Paul's traveling throughout this journey. And of course, verses 2 through 4, the residents of Malta apparently thought Justice, who was actually a Greek goddess, had singled Paul out because he deserved death. Right? And this is all because of a snake bite. Paul gets bit by a snake on the hand, and they think, oh, the snake bit him. They're really superstitious people, right? And the superstitious natives of Malta quickly decided that Paul was actually a god rather than a murderer, because Paul just flung this viper off of his hand into the fire as if nothing happened. So Paul pretty much shrugged off this false praise just as easily as he had shaken off the snake, as it were. And then, of course, he gets into Malta and he starts healing folks. And the honors that Paul received here in verses 9 and 10 may have actually been monetary rewards or payment for those healings. The same word is actually used elsewhere in Acts to indicate money in chapter 5, verse 2 and 3, in chapter 7, verse 16, and also in chapter 19, verse 9. So the journey aboard the Alexandrian ship probably began in February or shortly after, and of course the twin gods here that it says was actually Castor and Pollux, which is, if you look at the astrological signs, is Gemini, or the constellation Gemini, sons of Zeus. So sailors regarded them as gods and patrons of seafarers. So that's where the superstition stuff comes from with that as well. Now, and we get to verse 14, it's not really known how the brothers and sisters here came to be in Puteoli, but believers from Rome came down the Appian Way to 2 small towns there to greet and encourage Paul before his arrival in Rome. So these people were clearly hearing about Paul and hearing about what he has done in his ministry before he ever got to Rome, and they're coming to meet him along the way. While in Roman custody, Paul appears to have stayed on his own, and even at his own expense, guarded only by 1 soldier. Now, we know nothing more about this contact with the Roman government or the disposition of his case. What happened to his case here in the book of Acts? It doesn't really say anything about it. And this is the final time in Acts, when we get to verse 17, in which Paul began his ministry in a brand new city. And as usual, he started by contacting the Jews. Since he was in custody, though, he did things a little differently. He actually invited the Jewish leaders to visit him instead of going to them in their synagogue and preaching to them. So the Jews in Rome here had heard about this sect of Christianity that Paul was preaching about and promoting, but they had not received any official word from Paul or about Paul from Jerusalem. So the Church of Jerusalem hadn't sent any communication to Rome about the case that they had against Paul. Now, this lack of communication between Jerusalem and Rome may have been caused by winter weather. It may have indicated that the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem had just lost interest in Paul's case, since he was now out of their sight and beyond their jurisdiction, and he's probably unlikely to cause them any more trouble. at least not directly. But in any event, the Christians of Rome knew more about Paul's situation than did the unbelieving Jews. Now, like the risen Christ on the road to Emmaus, in verse 23 here, Paul showed how both the law of Moses and the prophets pointed to Jesus as God's Messiah. And in verses 25 through 27, Luke identifies this turning point in the discussion as Paul's provocative statement here, that the Holy Spirit was right about Israel's spiritual stubbornness through Isaiah and the prophet. It kind of caused some people to disagree with him and to kind of just wander off and turn away. And of course, the book of Acts here ends in an unexpected, open-ended fashion, really. Paul remained a prisoner for 2 whole years, it says, and during this time he lived at his own expense and was allowed to have visitors to whom he proclaimed his message boldly and without hindrance. And the church tradition has long held that Paul was beheaded during the persecution instigated by the Roman Emperor Nero in and around AD 64 or 65. Now, it is possible that Paul was executed in Rome after the 2 whole years, though church historian Eusebius, is spelled Eusebius, Eusebius. This is a historian guy who believed that Paul was released from Roman imprisonment only to be rearrested at a later date, sent to Rome, and then executed. But the fact that Luke does not write of Paul's execution, it leads some scholars to believe that Luke probably wrote this book of Acts before Paul's execution happened, though it is possible that Luke chose not to discuss the details of Paul's death because his aim here was to show that God had fulfilled his purpose in Paul taking the gospel to the Gentiles. So, clearly he has met those expectations with his writing here. Paul definitely fulfilled his purpose. And how or when he died, whether he was executed or he tripped and fell on a rock or what, it doesn't really make any difference because his purpose was fulfilled. It really doesn't change anything how he died. At least not in my opinion. Doesn't really matter. So, I hope this has helped you in your studies tonight. If it has, click that like button and subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell to get notified next time I upload a video. And if you're rumbling with me on Rumble, hit that little boxing glove. I'll see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. See you then.